The whisper came again, soft, deliberate, and wrong. Not wind, not memory, something calling. It slipped through the cave entrance the way cold slips beneath skin, finding seams meant to stay closed. For an instant, even the fire seemed to listen. Sparks froze mid-air like startled stars. The whisper shaped a name no living voice should know, a name stitched from river silk and grave breath. The rune at her throat flared in answer, light blooming sharp as ice, and the cave felt suddenly too small for breath, too fragile for whatever had found them. He moved before thought finished forming, a body trained to act when danger smelled like breath. The spear in his hand was a simple thing, wood and iron, but his stance made it a promise. He planted himself between the cave's mouth and the dark beyond, shoulders squared, eyes narrowing into the slit of a man who had learned to read threats in the way snow lay on branches. The bandage at his side tugged with the motion. Pain flared and he swallowed it down like a curse. Protecting her was not a choice so much as a reflex that had become a creed. She felt the whisper as if it had brushed the inside of her skull. The rune at her throat tightened, a cold band under linen that made her breath hitch. It was not merely the sound of a name, it was the ledger's voice, the river's ledger, the thing that had once given and then taken, with a patience that did not forgive. The cave's runes along the walls, reed crowns, hands cupped to water, ledgers balanced on stone, stirred as if waking from a long sleep. Their grooves caught the firelight and threw it back in thin, accusing lines. The priestess's marks were thresholds. They had been carved to listen. Now they leaned toward the mouth, as if to hear what the world would say. Outside, the snow held a shadow that moved with the deliberation of men who do not hurry. Hooves had been muffled by distance, but the tread of boots was a different geography. Measured, ceremonial, the kind of step that belongs to hunts and courts. The air beyond the cave tasted of iron and leather, and the faint, metallic tang of coin. The whisper came again, closer, threaded with the cadence of a voice that had been taught to command. It used the forbidden name like a key. He tightened his grip on the spear until his knuckles blanched. The motion was small and human, a man making himself a wall. He did not speak the name back. He did not need to. His jaw set, and the firelight carved his face into planes of resolve. The cave's runes answered his stance with a low vibration that ran through the stone and into the soles of their boots. It felt like the place itself was choosing a side, or at least noting the promise he had made to stand between the ledger and the living. She pressed a hand to the wall, feeling the cold of the stone through her glove. The rune at her throat pulsed in sympathy. With the carved grooves, a bell struck in a distant hall. The reaction was not merely physical. It was a memory uncoiling. The river's bargain had left a seam in her that the cave's old magic recognized. When the whisper used the name the river had given her, the mark flared as if someone had struck a match against the inside of her skin. Frost feathered at the edges of the linen and died before it could be named. The sensation left her hollowed and raw, like a wound reopened. The intruders did not shout. They did not need to. Their presence was a law that made the air itself rearrange. A horn answered the whisper from somewhere beyond the trees, a low, ceremonial note that rolled across the snow and into the cave like a drum. The sound made the fire gutter and the carving's shadows lengthen. The leader's voice called again, not a question, but a summons, the kind of voice that expects obedience. The syllables were measured, the cadence of men who had been taught to read ledgers and enforce them. He stepped forward a fraction, the spear tip a line of intent. The motion was both practical and intimate, a man placing himself where harm would strike first. She watched him with a look that was equal parts fear and something that wanted to be named. The rune at her throat hummed like a bell. The light under her linen softened and then flared, impatient, hungry. The closeness between them was a dangerous warmth, a human heat pressed against the cold ledger that lived in her. Each breath they shared felt like a small rebellion. The cave's carvings seemed to lean in the firelight, their grooves catching the flame and making the priestesses' faces look almost alive. Reed crowns and river women watched with the patience of old women who had seen bargains made and broken. The stone underfoot thrummed as if the place itself were taking stock. The whispering voice outside threaded through the thorns of the rune's glow and made the mark shiver. She felt with the animal certainty of someone who has been watched all her life, that the ledger was reading her like a page. A shadow detached itself from the dark beyond the mouth, and moved with the slow grace of a man who knows how to make an entrance. The figure carried no torch. The blood moon and the cave's fire were enough to cut him into silhouette. He wore a cloak that drank the light, and a helm that caught the moon in a single, cruel gleam. The leader's hand rested on the haft of a spear, like a man who keeps his oath close. For a moment, he stood in the threshold, a shape that could have been carved from the night itself. He stepped into the cave's light. Steel breathed in the moonlight, a cold exhale that made the cave's mouth feel like the throat of a beast. Frost rhymed the riders' cloaks and the edges of their helms, each plate and strap etched with the geometry of command, lines that read like ledgers, like the dead king's handwriting. The leader's spear caught the blood moon and threw it back in a thin, accusing gleam. He spoke once, and the syllable was a law. Show yourself. The voice carried the cadence of courts and hunts, the kind of tone that expects obedience, because it has been practiced into men for generations. It slid into the cave, and the runes along the wall answered with a low vibration, as if the stone itself were bracing. The carvings, reed crowns, and river women seemed to lean forward, grooves catching the firelight and throwing it back in thin, watchful lines. The air tightened like a drawn bow. He stepped forward, not with the swagger of a conqueror, but with the measured calm of someone who believes the world is a ledger, and he holds the pen. His cloak drank the cave's light. His boots left no sound on the packed earth. For a moment, he was only a silhouette, a shape that could have been carved from the night itself. Then the moonlight found his face, and the helm's crest made him look like a wound. Recognition moved through the riders like a current. One of them, a man whose breath steamed in the cold, let out a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a prayer. "By Hell's ledger," he said, and the words were a net thrown into the dark. "There she is." The name they used was careful, ceremonial, less a greeting than a claim. It hung in the cave like a gauntlet. He did not answer with words. He answered with a body. He stepped between her and the cave mouth, with the blunt, absolute motion of someone who has learned to be a wall. The spear in his hand was a line of intent. The haft rested against his hip like a promise. He angled his shoulder so that the light fell on him first. not on her. The motion was small and practical, and it changed the geometry of the cave. Where there had been two figures, there was now a shield. The leader's eyes narrowed, and for a breath, the world held its own. He studied the pair as if reading a contract. "You are the one who walks the river's seam," he said finally, voice low and precise. "You who took a life and returned it. The dead king's court will want an accounting." The words were not a question. They were a summons written in frost. She felt the syllables like a hand on the inside of her ribs. The rune at her throat tightened, and the light under her linen answered with a flare that was not warmth, but a white that cut the edges of the firelight. Frost feathered at the bandage and died before it could be named. The reaction was immediate and dangerous. The rune hummed like a bell struck in a distant hall, and the cave's carvings seemed to answer in sympathy. The priestess's marks were thresholds. They had been carved to listen. Now they listened, and the ledger inside her stirred. The leader's gaze flicked to the rune and then away, as if the sight had been a thing he had been taught to notice and then to ignore. "We have orders," he said, the sentence a blade wrapped in velvet. "The dead king claims what is bound to his ledger." The implication was a net. They would take what the ledger named, and they would do so with the patience of men who had been taught to keep accounts. He tightened his grip on the spear until his knuckles blanched. The motion was a small, human thing, an instinct made muscle. He did not shout. He did not make a show. He simply moved so that his body was the first thing the riders would meet. The closeness between them was a dangerous warmth. His shoulder brushed her arm, and the contact was a tether. She let herself be anchored by it, not because she needed saving in that moment, but because the promise in his stance steadied the ledger's edges. The rider's leader smiled without humor, a thin thing that did not reach his eyes. "Step forward," he said again, and the cave's mouth framed him like a judge's bench. "The dead king's court will hear your account." The words were ceremonial, the kind of language that makes law out of breath. Around him the other riders shifted, the scrape of leather and the clink of metal, a low, patient chorus. She felt the rune flare at the sound of the leader's voice, a white drumbeat under linen that made the air taste of iron. The light under her throat pulsed in time with the rider's measured steps, and the carvings along the wall seemed to lean in as if to read the ledger she carried. The cave's old magic hummed, a low vibration that threaded through stone and bone. It was as if the place itself were taking stock of the moment and finding the margins filled. He met the leader's eyes and did not flinch. There was no bravado in his stare, only a quiet, dangerous resolve. "You will not take her without account," he said, voice low and steady. The sentence was not a negotiation. It was a line drawn in the snow. The leader's smile thinned further, and for a moment the two men regarded each other like two ledgers being compared. The riders shifted closer, boots finding the cave's packed earth, with a sound that made the fire gutter. The leader's hand rested on the haft of his spear, a small, practiced motion. The rune at her throat flared again, brighter and angrier this time, and the cave answered with a susurration that ran along the carvings like wind through reeds. Something in the air changed, an intake, a recalculation. The riders drew nearer, sensing that the ledger they had come to read might not be as simple as they had been told. A single, violent motion broke the cave's hush. A torch toppled, sparks scattering like startled birds, and the runes answered with a surge that felt almost like a shout. Stone dust fell from the ceiling as if the cave itself had been startled awake. The sudden light and the white flare at her throat made the riders hesitate. A fraction of a second that was all the world could spare. In that fraction they moved, boots finding the packed earth, breath a hot, visible thing, and the night swallowed them. They ran into the pines with the raw, animal speed of people who have learned to move when the world demands it. Snow rose in their wake, a white plume that swallowed footprints and erased the map of where they had been. Branches slapped at faces and shoulders, needles stung like 1,000 small accusations, and the cold bit through linen and leather until breath came in sharp, visible prayers. The forest closed around them, a living wall of trunks and shadow, and the riders' horns answered like distant thunder. The chase was geometry, a line of two against a widening arc of men and horses. Hooves thudded on the outer ring of the trees, muffled by distance but steady as a drum. Voices threaded through the pines, low, ceremonial, the kind of sound that makes the air itself rearrange. The riders did not shout. They did not need to. Their presence was a law that moved with the patience of winter. They followed the scent of a ledger, the echo of a name, the trail of a woman the dead king had claimed. Snow clung to eyelashes and to the lashes of the trees. Breath fogged and braided. Each exhale was a small, visible vow. The rune at her throat pulsed with every step, a white drumbeat under linen that made the world taste of iron. Frost feathered at her lips and died before it could be named. She kept the power small, tiny blooms at the edges of her fingers, a hush of cold that stiffened a branch and made a rider's cloak crackle. But each use took warmth like a tax. The ledger inside her hummed in answer, patient and hungry. He moved with the blunt, efficient grace of someone who has learned to be a wall and a path at once. His spear was a line of intent. His shoulder took blows from branches and the scrape of a rider's net. When the snow made his footing treacherous, he steadied her with a hand at the small of her back, fingers digging through linen into the warmth beneath. The contact was a tether, practical, necessary, and intimate in a way that made both of them breathe differently. They did not speak. Words would have been a luxury the night could not afford. Instead, they traded small mercies, a tightened knot, a shared gulp of water, a look that said more than any vow. Fear braided with something else, an ache that had nothing to do with wounds. The chase sharpened the edges of what they had been building in the cave, a closeness that was both forbidden and inevitable. When he caught her wrist to pull her over a fallen trunk, their faces were inches apart, breath mingling in the cold. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the press of his palm and the bell of the rune. The moment was a dangerous mercy. It made the ledger's teeth feel both nearer and less absolute. She wanted to tell him everything and feared the cost if she did. He wanted to promise safety, and new promises were fragile in a world that kept accounts. The rider's pursuit was relentless. They threaded the trees with a patience that made the forest itself seem to lean toward them. A rider's cloak snagged on a branch and tore, with a sound like a small animal's cry. Another slipped on a hidden root and cursed, the syllable swallowed by the pines. The leader's horn answered each small delay with a low, ceremonial note that kept the hunt moving like a metronome. The sound made the aurora above them shiver, a green seam that looked like a vein under pressure. Snow hid tracks and revealed them in the same breath. Where they had thought to lose their pursuers, the riders found a line of broken branches and a smear of blood on the snow, evidence that the world kept accounts even when men tried to erase them. The chase bent like a river around obstacles. A stand of birch, a ravine half hidden by drift, a slope that made lungs burn. Each obstacle was a test of endurance and of the fragile trust between them. When she stumbled, he caught her. When he faltered, she steadied him with a hand at his elbow. The intimacy of survival was a slow, dangerous thing. At one point, a rider's voice cut through the trees like a blade. "There," he said, and the word was a map. The leader's silhouette moved between trunks, a dark shape that seemed to drink the moonlight. The riders closed ranks with the efficiency of men who have practiced this choreography for years. The forest's hush turned into a chorus of pursuit. The scrape of leather, the creak of saddles, the steady breath of horses. The night itself seemed to press in, making every sound a verdict. They ran until the trees thinned and the world opened into a wide, white plain. The air tasted different there, cleaner, sharper, as if the land itself had been waiting for them to arrive. Ahead, the river lay like a seam of glass, a black ribbon cut through the snow. Its surface was a mirror that held the sky and the blood moon and the aurora in a single cold face. The frozen river was a boundary and a promise, a place where the living could stand and the dead could be near. They slowed at the river's edge, chests heaving, boots sinking into the drift. The riders' horns answered from the tree line, a low, patient sound that made the hair on their arms rise. For a moment they simply stood, two figures against a white that made the world look like a ledger. The rune at her throat pulsed in time with the river's hush, and the air tasted of iron and old prayers. Beyond the pines, the hunt closed in. They had reached the frozen river. The river groaned like a living thing, a long, low sound that ran under the snow and up through the soles of their boots. Moonlight struck the ice in a hard, white seam, and the blood moon painted the surface in bruised copper. The frozen ribbon reflected the sky as if the world had been split and laid flat. Cracks spidered across the glassy face, hairline fractures that caught the light and made the river look like a sleeping beast, with veins of silver. Each step toward it felt like stepping onto a held breath. They paused at the bank where the snow fell away to reveal the ice's edge, a lip of black glass that drank the moon. The air tasted of iron and old prayers. The aurora above braided the sky into a slow, green vein. He tested the ice with the spear's butt, a measured percussion that sent a tiny chorus of answers through the haft. The sound was a warning, thin, high, the note of a thing that might not hold. He moved with the economy of someone who has learned to measure danger by weight and sound, each motion precise because there was no room for waste. Beneath the surface, the river remembered. She heard it first as a susurration, a chorus like cloth on stone, then as voices that were not voices but impressions, water and ledger, hush and counting. The rune at her throat thrummed in sympathy. A bell struck in a distant hall. The ice's reflection bent the moon into a coin, and the coin seemed to spin, revealing a face she had once known. Whispers threaded through the glass, names, promises, the soft arithmetic of debts. The river's memory was patient, and it had a long reach. It remembered the touch of her hands and the bargain that had been struck in a night of fever and black water. He felt the change in her like a shift in the weather. Her fingers tightened on the haft of his spear. The small of her back pressed into him as if to anchor herself to a human warmth. The contact was a tether, practical and intimate, and it steadied both of them. The forbidden closeness between them was a dangerous warmth in a world that kept accounts. Each breath they shared fogged the air and braided with the aurora's green seam. The moment was a fragile thing balanced on the edge of confession and consequence. They moved onto the ice with the slow, careful steps of people who know how quickly a surface can betray. The first footfall was a whisper, the second made a hairline crack sing. The spear's butt tapped ahead like a metronome, a rhythm that measured the river's patience. The ice flexed under weight and answered, with a sound like distant thunder. He kept his body between her and the open sky, shoulders squared, spear angled to catch whatever might come. The rider's horns were a distant drum now, a cadence that grew louder with each breath. She listened to the river as if it were a language she had once spoken and only half remembered. The whispers beneath the ice were not accusatory. They were ledger-like, patient as a ledger that waits for a signature. They spoke of balance and names, of a seam sewn into the world that would not be undone by desire. Sometimes the voices were a comfort, familiar syllables that felt like home, and sometimes they were a blade that cut through the marrow. The rune at her throat pulsed in time with the river's hush, and each pulse took a small piece of warmth from her, like a toll. The ice shifted. A long, thin crack ran ahead of them, a white line that spidered outward and made the moonlight jitter. He felt the change in the haft under his palm, and the hair on his arms rose. The river's surface was a mirror that could break into 1,000 knives. He moved faster, not reckless but urgent, guiding their steps to the thicker seams, reading the ice like a man who had learned to read maps in the dark. The riders' shouts threaded through the trees now, closer, a chorus of measured voices that made the night itself seem to lean toward them. When a rider's boot struck the ice at the far bank, the sound was a gunshot in the hush. The leader's silhouette cut the horizon like a spear. The horn answered with a ceremonial note that rolled across the plain and into the river's glass. The ice answered back with a tremor that ran through their boots and up into their bones. For a breath, the world was only the two of them, and the thin, dangerous skin between life and the cold below. He reached for her hand as they crossed a widening fissure, fingers closing around hers with a pressure that said more than words. The touch was a promise and a plea. "Stay with me," he seemed to say without speaking. She let herself be held, the contact anchoring her to the living world while the river's ledger hummed under the ice. The closeness between them was a small rebellion against the accounts that would claim her. It was also a confession that neither dared name aloud. The ice groaned again, a long, animal sound that made the aurora shiver. A thin sheet buckled under the weight of a distant horse, and the sound echoed like a bell. The river's whispers rose in pitch, a chorus that threaded through the glass and touched the rune at her throat like a finger on a bell. She felt the memory of the bargain as if it were a hand at her sternum. Firm, patient, inevitable. He looked at her then, eyes wide with a fear that was not for himself, but for the ledger she carried. The moment stretched, a fragile thing balanced on the edge of survival and confession. The riders' silhouettes moved like dark leaves on the far bank, closing the circle. The river's voice under the ice swelled into a tide of sound that made the hair on their arms stand up. Something beneath the ice reached upward. The ice split with a sound like a rib snapping, a long, terrible note that ran under their boots and up into their teeth. Water answered the crack with a cold rush, a hiss that turned the air to glass. For a heartbeat, the river was a mouth opening, and something pale and patient pressed against the underside of the ice. An impression like a hand, then another, then a chorus of fingers that wanted to find purchase. The frozen surface shivered beneath their feet, as if the world itself had remembered the bargain and was testing its seams. She heard the river first, not with ears but with the bell at her throat. A chorus of ledger voices, patient and precise, naming balances and margins. The rune flared white and hot under linen, a light that was not warmth but a cold that burned inward. The whispers beneath the ice braided with that light and became a command she could not ignore. He felt the change in her like a weather shift. Her shoulders tightened, her breath shortened, and the small of her back pressed into him as if to anchor herself to a human warmth. The ice buckled. A fissure ran like a white vein between them and the far bank, widening with a sound like distant thunder. The river's memory reached up through the glass and touched the rune at her throat, and she answered with a thing she had kept small for years, a bloom of frost fire that was not flame, but a white, living cold. It rose from her palms in a bloom that smelled of iron and old prayers, a bloom that ate the edges of the crack and sealed them with a skin of glass so thin it might have been a promise. The cost was immediate. The bloom took warmth like a toll. Her fingers went numb as if the cold had been siphoned from her veins. The light under her linen dimmed to a bruise. She staggered, the motion small and human, and the world tilted. He caught her without thinking, arms closing around her as if to hold the last of her heat. The contact was a tether. The rune answered with a flare that made the carvings along the riverbank look like they were carved from ice. He saw the truth then, in a way he had not before. The power she carried was not a trick of weather, but a ledger written into flesh. The frost fire that had saved them was beautiful and monstrous, a thing that reshaped the world to keep them whole. It had sealed the ice with a skin of white that would hold long enough for them to cross, but it had taken from her in return. Her lips were pale. The light in her eyes had a thinness to it, as if a part of her had been folded away to pay for the miracle. The sight made something in him break open, rage at the ledger, grief at the cost, and a fierce, animal devotion that had nothing to do with law. He did not speak the words that crowded his chest. There was no time for speeches. The riders' horns answered from the far bank, a low, ceremonial note that rolled across the plain and into the river's glass. The leader's silhouette moved like a spear against the horizon. The hunt closed with the patience of winter. He hauled her forward, spear tapping the ice like a metronome, guiding their steps to the seams she had sealed. Each footfall was a negotiation with the river's patience. Each breath fogged the air and braided with the aurora's green seam. She moved because she had to, because the ledger inside her would not allow hesitation. The frost fire had bought them a path, but it had also hollowed her in a way that made every step cost more. Her knees trembled. The bandage at his side had come loose, and he tightened it with one hand while the other kept her upright. The intimacy of that motion, his hands on her, the press of their bodies against the cold, was a dangerous warmth in a world that kept accounts. They crossed the river like two people walking a seam between worlds, the ice singing under their weight, and the river whispering names they did not want to hear. When they reached the far bank, the sealed skin of ice held for a breath, and then sighed, a thin sound like a thing relieved. Snow swallowed their footprints as if the land wanted to forget the passage. They stumbled into the pines, branches slapping at their faces, needles stinging like 1,000 small accusations. The forest closed around them with the hush of old things, and the aurora braided the sky into a slow, indifferent seam. He pressed his forehead to hers for a moment, the contact a benediction and a vow. Her breath came shallow, the rune at her throat glowed like a bruise. They did not stop to rest. The riders' horns answered from the plain, closer now, a drumbeat that made the trees tremble. The chase bent like a river around the trunks, a stand of birch, a ravine half hidden by drift, a slope that made lungs burn. Each obstacle was a test of endurance and of the fragile trust between them. When she faltered, he steadied her. When he stumbled, she steadied him with a hand at his elbow. The intimacy of survival was a slow, dangerous thing. The cost of the frost fire showed in small ways. Her fingers left no prints in the snow, as if the cold had taken the warmth that makes a mark. Her voice, when she tried to speak, came out thin and distant. She had given a piece of herself to the river's ledger to buy them a path, and the piece was not merely warmth, but something that felt like memory. Edges of nights she could no longer name, a seam of feeling that had gone quiet. He watched her with a grief that had no words, and in that watching he understood the ledger's cruelty. It did not demand payment in coin, but in pieces of the self. They pushed deeper into the woods, branches closing like a curtain behind them. Snow muffled the rider's approach, but the horns still threaded through the trees, a low, patient sound. For a moment, they allowed themselves a breath that was not all fear. Two bodies pressed together, the press of a hand at a jaw, the small, human warmth that had nothing to do with ledgers. The moment was fragile and necessary. A lone figure stood in the trees, like a carved thing, unmoving as a totem, watching them with a patience that felt older than the pines. He wore no torch. Moonlight cut his face into planes of shadow and frost. His bow hung loose in one hand, a simple curve of wood, but his eyes were the thing that held the night, cold, river deep, as if he had learned to read currents and names the way others read weather. For a long breath, the forest held him like a secret, and the two of them felt the weight of being seen. He stepped forward without hurry, boots making no sound on the packed snow. The hunter's cloak drank the moonlight. His breath came in a thin, steady line. He did not look like a rider, no crest, no ceremonial armor, but there was a certainty in his stance that belonged to men who keep accounts of their own. When he spoke, his voice was low and dry as driftwood. "You should not have come this far," he said. And the words were not a threat, so much as a ledger being opened. Einar moved before thought could shape itself, a wall of muscle and resolve between the hunter and the woman at his side. The spear in his hand was a blunt, honest thing. His shoulders squared as if to take the world's first blow. The motion was automatic, the kind of reflex that had been honed by winters and fights, and the need to keep a promise. He did not ask the hunter who he was. He did not need to. The forest had taught him to read danger in the set of a jaw and the tilt of a head. The hunter's eyes flicked to the rune at her throat and lingered there as if reading a page. He smiled without warmth. "You are not what the riders think," he said. "You are what the river remembers." The sentence landed like a stone. The rune at her throat answered with a flare so quick it made the air taste of iron. Frost feathered at the edge of her collar and died before it could be named. The hunter's gaze did not waver. He had the look of someone who had been waiting for a name to be spoken. She felt the words like a hand at the back of her ribs, old, precise, and impossible to ignore. Shame rose first, a hot, private thing that made her fingers curl into the linen at her throat. She had kept the ledger's edges hidden because the world preferred tidy stories. Now a stranger in the woods read the margins as if they were open books. The closeness between her and the man who had become her shield tightened into something that felt like both refuge and indictment. Breath fogged between them. The aurora braided the sky like a vein. The hunter stepped closer, and in the hush, the trees seemed to lean in. He spoke again, and this time his voice carried the cadence of prophecy rather than accusation. "They call you a thief," he said. "They call you a miracle. But names are not the same as truth. The river did not simply return you. It made you a seam." The word hung in the air like a verdict. The rune at her throat pulsed in answer. A bell struck in a distant hall. Einar's jaw tightened. He had learned to read ledgers in the language of men, orders, oaths, the geometry of command. But this was a different accounting. He planted his feet like a man who would not be moved by rumor. "What do you want?" he asked, voice low and steady. The question was practical. The night allowed no room for speeches. The hunter's smile thinned. "I want nothing that the river will not give," he said. "I want only to speak the truth aloud, so that the world can choose." He reached into his cloak and produced a small object wrapped in oilcloth, a scrap of leather, a charm of reeds, something that smelled of peat and old prayers. He did not offer it. He let it hang between them like a token. "There is a prophecy," he said. It was carved into a stone in a hall that no longer stands. It says, "When the bride walks the seam, the ledger will open, and the dead king will seek a passage. The name she keeps is the key." The words struck her like a cold wind. The rune at her throat flared so violently that she had to bite back a cry. The hunter's eyes were steady on her face, as if he could read the ledger written there. "If the name is spoken by another," he said, "the river will answer. If it is spoken by the one who loves her, the ledger will take its due." The sentence was a blade wrapped in a riddle. The forest seemed to hold its breath. She felt the world tilt. The secret she had folded into herself like a knife, kept because the ledger demanded silence, suddenly felt exposed. Shame and fear braided with a fierce, private longing. The thought that the man who had stood between her and the world might be named by the ledger as payment. Her fingers tightened on his cloak. He met her eyes, and in that look there was a vow that needed no priest's ink. The hunter's voice dropped to a whisper that threaded through the trees. "I have watched the river for years," he said. "I have listened to the names it keeps. I have waited to see if the bride would choose to be a gate or to break the seam." He stepped closer, so near that the breath between them fogged the air. "There is a name the river gave you when it returned you," he said, and the syllables he used were soft as snow. "A name you never spoke aloud." The world narrowed to the hunter's mouth and the rune's bell. She had never told anyone that name. Not the priestesses, not the boy she had saved, not the man who had tried to pull her from the river. It was a thing kept in the dark because names are doors, and doors can be opened by those who know how to turn the key. The hunter's lips moved and the forest listened. "Nerith," he said, and the sound was not wind, but a verdict. Thank you for being here. I hope you enjoyed this chapter. This tale is inspired by Nordic dreams and heart. Stay close for the next chapter of this saga. With love, Claire.